before there were cities, before there were kings, before the first farmer pressed the first seed into the first fold of dark earth. There was water, and in that water, older than memory and wilder than storm, something waited. Its name was YAM. Take a slow breath. Let the sound of that word settle. In the ancient Ugaritic language, spoken along the coast of what we now call Syria, perhaps 3,400 years ago, YAM meant simply sea. But what the people of Ugarit meant when they whispered that name was something far older than language could contain. They did not mean water. They meant the force in water, the pressure beneath the surface, the thing that pulled ships under and answered to no one. YAM was, by most accounts, the firstborn son of El, the supreme father god of the Canaanite pantheon. El was ancient and grey, bearded, the great patriarch, the god who presided over the assembly of all divine beings. And to his firstborn he gave a gift that no other god received, dominion. Not over a field, not over a harvest, not over a city, over everything that moved and breathed and feared. El named YAM ruler of all the gods, lord of the divine assembly, judge of the river. The title is exact, and it matters, because rivers, like the sea, are ungovernable things. They rise when they wish. They take what they find. And YAM, it seems, embodied that principle completely. That distinction is worth pausing on. We are trained, most of us, to hear the word chaos and feel unease. But the ancient people of Canaan and Ugarit did not think of chaos the way we do. Chaos was not destruction. It was potential. It was the condition of the world before form arrived. YAM was the embodiment of that primordial state, the deep, roiling, pressurized existence that preceded civilization, preceded agriculture, preceded the careful arrangement of things into hierarchies and systems and meaning. He was what the world had been, and he refused to stop being it. The myths preserved in the Ugaritic tablets, excavated beginning in 1929 from the ancient city of Ras Shamra on the Syrian coast, now housed carefully in museums in Damascus and Paris, tell us what happened when that primal force finally encountered resistance. When the storm god Baal, beloved of the people, provider of rain and fertility and life, looked across the divine assembly at the creature who claimed lordship over everything and decided he would not yield. What followed was one of the oldest recorded battles in all of human mythology, older than the wars of the Greek gods on Olympus, older by centuries than the dragon-slaying epics of Babylon's Enuma Elish. YAM sent messengers to El's court, two terrifying envoys with faces like flames and gates like predators, demanding that Baal be handed over as a slave. The other gods trembled and looked at the ground. Only Baal stood. The craftsman god Kothar, Karsis, a kind of divine smith, a maker of sacred weapons, fashioned two magical clubs and placed them in Baal's hands. They were given names. They were spoken to, like living things. And with them, Baal drove YAM back into the deep. But here's what the tablets understand that many later traditions forgot. YAM was not destroyed. Gods of chaos are never truly destroyed. They are subdued, pressed down, held under the weight of a newer, more organized world. They wait in the dark places, in the undertow, in the storm swell, in the place where the seafloor drops away into nothing. Patient as water is patient, which is to say endlessly. In the episodes that follow, we will walk through every dimension of this extraordinary being. We will explore the full mythology of YAM and Baal, the battle at the heart of Canaanite religion, and what it tells us about how ancient people understood power and nature. We will follow the strange and winding path by which YAM's mythology threaded itself through the Hebrew Bible, appearing, transformed but unmistakable, in the book of Job, in the Psalms, in the great creation poems of Genesis. We will ask what archaeologists found at Ras Shamra and how a buried library of clay tablets gave us back a mythology that had been silent for 3,000 years. We will look at YAM's relatives, the chaos serpent Lotan, the Babylonian Tiamat, the biblical Leviathan, and understand how these figures are not separate inventions but a single ancient idea, wearing different faces across different cultures and centuries. And we will sit with the larger question that YAM quietly poses to anyone who listens long enough. What does a civilization lose when it stops making room, even in its stories, for the wild and unmanageable things? So settle in. There is no urgency here. The water has been waiting a very long time, and it is not going anywhere. We will take this slowly, the way the tide takes things, steadily, inevitably, with a kind of patient enormity that leaves you standing at the edge of something vast and grateful that you came. This is the story of YAM, the conflict at the heart of Canaanite religion. There is a particular quality to the silence just before a storm breaks. The air changes, the birds stop. Even the sea, for just a moment, seems to hold itself very still, as though it knows what is coming and is deciding how it feels about that. The ancient people of Canaan knew that silence intimately. They lived inside it, season after season, scanning the horizon for rain that would either come or would not. And the stories they told about their gods carry that same quality. A vast, pressurized stillness, and then something enormous moving through it. The conflict between Baal and YAM is, at its core, a story about that moment. About what happens when two irreconcilable forces finally occupy the same space, and one of them has to give way. But to understand the battle, to feel the full weight of it, we need to understand the world it took place in. The divine world of Ugarit was not so different from the human one. It had politics, it had courts and councils and rivalries and favor-seeking, and the slow, grinding work of maintaining one's position against the ambitions of others. The gods of Canaan were not remote and crystalline, they were complicated. At the top of that world sat El. In Ugaritic, his name means simply God, a word so foundational that it became the generic term for divinity across much of the ancient Semitic world. You hear it in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Arabic. El was depicted as a bearded patriarch, seated on a throne, robed and patient, the kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice. The texts call him Father of Years, not because he was old in any mortal sense, but because he predated years themselves. He was there before time had a shape, before the calendar, before the counting, and to this figure, ancient beyond reckoning, YAM had attached himself, not by conquest, by birthright. The texts are clear on this point. El loved YAM. He called him his beloved, his favored one. He gave him a palace. He gave him a throne. He gave him the title Judge of the River, and with it, authority over all other divine beings. This was not an arrangement the other gods chose. It was simply the arrangement that existed. YAM ruled because El said YAM ruled, and El's word was the oldest law there was. To challenge YAM was not merely to pick a fight. It was to challenge the will of the Father of all things. Only one god was reckless enough, or brave enough to try. Baal's full name in the Ugaritic tablets is Baal Hadad, Baal the Thunderer. Baal simply means Lord or Master, but over time the name became so thoroughly associated with this one particular deity that it ceased to function as a title and became a proper name in its own right. He was the god of storms, yes, but more specifically, he was the god of the life-giving storm, the rain that broke the drought, the cloud bank that rolled in off the sea in autumn and soaked the fields and guaranteed another harvest. He was, in the most direct sense, the god the farmers needed, the god that kept people alive, and that made him, in the hearts of ordinary Canaanite people, the most beloved figure in the divine assembly. Regardless of what the formal hierarchy said, the tablets pick up the story at a moment of open confrontation. YAM, from his palace, sends a delegation to El's court. Two messengers. Their appearance in the text is deliberate and unsettling. They arrive without bowing. This detail, small as it sounds, would have been electrifying to an ancient audience. In the court protocol of the ancient Near East, failure to bow before the divine assembly was an act of profound aggression. It was a declaration. These messengers held their heads level, their faces forward, and they delivered YAM's demand with the flat authority of someone who does not expect to be refused. Hand over Baal. Give him to us as our slave. The assembly of gods flinched. The tablets describe them dropping their heads to their knees, pressing their faces toward the great table, shrinking in their seats. Here was the most revealing moment in the entire myth, because these were gods, immortal, powerful, ageless beings. And they were afraid. They were afraid because YAM was not merely powerful in the way that a strong warrior is powerful. YAM was powerful in the way that the ocean is powerful, without limit, without negotiation, without the faintest interest in what you wanted or needed or feared. To oppose him was not bravery. It was, by all reasonable calculation, foolishness. Baal did not flinch. The text has him rebuking the other gods for their cowardice. Almost contemptuous, impatient, the energy of a young storm that has not yet learned to be afraid of anything. He would not be handed over. He would not kneel. And crucially, he would not wait for El to intercede or the situation to resolve itself diplomatically. He was going to settle this in the only language that YAM, Lord of the Primordial Deep, actually understood. This is where Kothar Wa, Karses, enters the story, and it is worth slowing down to appreciate him properly. His name is sometimes translated as skillful and wise, and he was the craftsman of the gods, the divine artisan, the maker of sacred things. In the ancient world, the smith occupied a peculiar and somewhat uncanny position in society. Smiths worked with fire. They transformed raw, formless material into objects of precision and power. There was something almost magical about it, and in mythologies across the world, Norse, Greek, Mesopotamian, Canaanite, the divine craftsman figure tends to carry that same aura of someone who operates at the edge of what is naturally possible. Kothar made two weapons for Baal, not swords, not spears. Clubs, great heavy driving weapons, the kind that end arguments with blunt and absolute finality. But these were not ordinary clubs, and the text makes sure we understand that. Kothar gave them names. The first he called Yagrush, which means chaser. The second he called Imo, which means driver. He spoke to each of them as he handed them over, incanting their purpose into them the way a smith might speak a prayer over finished work. The weapons had identity. They had intention. In the cosmology of Ugarit, the boundary between a made thing and a living thing was considerably more porous than we might assume. Kothar was also, the texts suggest, deeply invested in this outcome. There is a moment of almost conspiratorial enthusiasm in his instructions to Baal, a sense that the craftsman god had been waiting for someone with the nerve to actually use what he could make. He told Baal to drive YAM from his throne. He told him to strike, and where to strike. And then he stepped back, because what came next was not craft. It was force. The first blow landed, and YAM did not fall. He staggered, but the sea does not fall easily. It absorbs, it disperses, it reconstitutes. This moment in the tablets is extraordinary. The myth does not give Baal an easy victory. Yagrush strikes YAM across the shoulders, a blow that would have destroyed anything mortal, and YAM sways but holds. He is still standing. He is still YAM. And in that beat of the story, the ancient writers revealed something profound about what they believed chaos actually was. It was not the kind of thing you could defeat with a single good strike. It had to be struck twice. It had to be driven back deliberately, purposefully, blow after blow, with full commitment and no flinching. There was no shortcut. There was no trick. There was only the long, exhausting, necessary work of pushing the wild thing back to where it could be endured. The second club, Ima, the driver, struck YAM between the eyes, and this time the sea god collapsed. He fell to the earth. His joints went slack. His form, so vast and terrible a moment before, crumpled. The tablets record Baal standing over him, Astarte, goddess of love and war, who'd been calling from the sidelines, urging Baal on, screaming his name over the noise of the battle, now intervened. She told Baal that YAM was already his prisoner, that there was no need to kill him, that a god defeated and subdued was already a god transformed into something manageable. Baal, it seems, agreed. He did not destroy YAM. He scattered him. He broke the shape of him and drove the pieces back into the water, and the divine assembly, which had been hiding its face, looked up. In the aftermath of the battle, the texts shift their focus to what Baal would build next: his own palace, his own throne, his own authority over the ordered world. But the myth is careful, even in its account of Baal's triumph, never to declare YAM gone. Scattered is not the same as annihilated. Driven back is not the same as erased. The sea was still there. It always would be. What changed was simply the arrangement between the wild and the ordered. A negotiation that, the Canaanites seemed to understand, would need to be renewed again and again, in every generation, by every people who chose to build their lives close to the water. The storm had won. For now. And in Canaan's long agricultural year, that was everything that mattered. The rain would come, the fields would drink, the world would hold together for another season. But deep beneath the ordered surface of things, in the dark where the light does not reach, something old and formless and patient continued to move. It always does. YAM in the Hebrew Bible. There is a particular kind of survival that requires no monuments, no temples, no unbroken chain of devoted priests. It requires only language. A word, pressed into enough mouths across enough generations, carries its original weight long after the culture that first shaped it has dissolved entirely. The people forget the myth. They forget the god. They forget the court of El and the battle at the edge of the deep. But the word remains. And sometimes, if you know what you are listening for, you can hear the old thing breathing inside it. The Hebrew word is tehom. It appears in the second verse of the book of Genesis, one of the most scrutinized sentences in all of human literature, where the text describes the condition of the world before God began to shape it. The earth, it says, was tohu wabohu, formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the tehom, the deep, the abyss, the ancient, undifferentiated water that preceded everything else. For a long time, scholars treated tehom as simply a descriptive term, a poetic word for primordial water, but the closer linguists looked at it, and particularly after the Ugaritic tablets were discovered and deciphered in the 20th century, the clearer a different picture became. Tehom is linguistically related to Tiamat, the great chaos dragon of Babylonian mythology, who was also a creature of the primordial deep, also defeated by a younger storm god, also subdued and reshaped into the fabric of the ordered world. And Tiamat herself belongs to the same ancient Semitic conceptual family as YAM. The connection is not metaphorical. It is etymological. It is buried in the bones of the word itself. What this means, in practical terms, is quietly stunning. When the author of Genesis wrote about the darkness hovering over the face of the deep, they were, consciously or not, drawing on a tradition that was already ancient. invoking the same primordial force that the people of Ugarit had called YAM, the chaos that preceded creation, the wet, formless, ungovernable condition of existence before a divine hand began to impose order on it. The God of Genesis moves over those waters and separates them and pushes them back and makes space for dry land and light and life, which is, structurally, precisely what Baal does to YAM. The myth has been transformed, monotheized, stripped of its dramatis personae, its messengers and craftsmen and divine assemblies, but the underlying architecture, a divine force confronting primordial watery chaos and subduing it to make room for the ordered world. That architecture is intact. The writers of Genesis were not borrowing carelessly. They were doing something more deliberate, taking the oldest story their neighbors told and retelling it in a way that carried an entirely different argument about the nature of divine power. In the Canaanite version, the battle between order and chaos is a genuine contest. YAM is powerful. He nearly wins. The outcome is in doubt, and the victory costs something. In Genesis, there is no contest. The chaos does not fight back. God speaks, and it yields. The water does not need to be struck with a club and driven back with tremendous effort. It simply parts and retreats when addressed. The difference is theologically enormous, and it was almost certainly intentional. The Israelite writers knew the older story. They lived in the same cultural landscape as the people who told it. The subversion was the point, but Genesis is only the beginning. YAM, or rather, the memory of YAM, the shape of YAM, the theological problem that YAM represented, surfaces throughout the Hebrew Bible in ways that range from subtle to almost explicit, and nowhere more powerfully than in the book of Job. Job is, by any measure, one of the strangest and most philosophically serious texts in the entire biblical canon. It is the story of a blameless man to whom catastrophic suffering is permitted to happen, and who then has the audacity to demand an explanation from God. His friends arrive one by one and offer the conventional theological responses. You must have sinned, suffering is always deserved, God is just, and therefore your pain is your own fault. Job rejects every one of these arguments with passionate, exhausted precision. He knows he has done nothing wrong. He wants to know why. And when God finally answers, from the whirlwind, in one of the most astonishing speeches in ancient literature, the answer is not an explanation. It is a confrontation with scale. God asks Job, in verse after magnificent verse, whether he was there when the foundations of the earth were laid, whether he has entered the springs of the sea, whether he has walked in the recesses of the deep, whether he can bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion. The questions are not cruel. They are cosmic. They are an invitation to understand that the universe is vaster and stranger and more ancient than any single human life, and that the forces which govern it do not operate according to the moral ledger that Job's friends assumed. And then, precisely here, in the middle of this speech, YAM appears by name. God asks Job, who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. The sea in this passage is not a backdrop. It is a character. It bursts forth. It has pride. It has momentum. It has to be physically restrained with doors and bars and a spoken boundary. Thus far and no farther, as though it were a force still straining against its containment, still pressing at the limits that were set for it in the first moments of creation. This is YAM, not named as a god, not placed in a divine assembly, but present in everything except the name itself. The chaotic sea that had to be shut in and bounded, that left to its own nature, would overwhelm the dry land and everything on it. The Book of Job does something remarkable. It uses the untamed sea not as a villain, but as evidence. Evidence that the world contains powers beyond human comprehension, and that this is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. This is a profound theological move. In the Canaanite tradition, YAM was a genuine rival to the ordered world, a being of ambition and destructive power who had to be defeated before civilization could exist. In Job, the sea is still wild and still primordial and still bounded only by divine decree. But the wildness is now part of the argument for God's greatness, not evidence of a competing force. The chaos does not threaten the order. It illuminates the order's magnitude. Only something this powerful, the text implies, could have set limits on something that vast. The Psalms offer yet another register. Psalm 89 speaks directly of God crushing Rahab, another name for the sea chaos creature, and scattering the enemies with a mighty arm. Psalm 74 describes God breaking the heads of the sea monsters on the waters, crushing Leviathan, cutting openings for springs and torrents. Psalm 93 declares that the floods have lifted up their voice, that the floods lift up their roaring, but that the Lord on high is mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The cadence of these passages is unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Ugaritic material. They are victory hymns. They are the liturgical descendants of the Baal cycle, retuned, redirected, transferred to a single God who has absorbed into himself both the function of Baal, the conqueror, and El, the patriarch, but who still stands, as Baal once stood, over a sea that has been defeated, but not destroyed. There is something deeply human in this persistence. The people who wrote these psalms were not archaeologists. They were not trying to preserve Canaanite mythology for the benefit of future scholarship. They were trying to pray. They were reaching for the most powerful images available to them, for the experience of divine might confronting something overwhelming. And the most powerful images available were the ones their culture had been rehearsing for centuries, before the biblical texts were ever set down. The sea was still there. It was still terrifying. It still rose in storms and took ships and drowned the unlucky and indifferent. You did not need to believe in YAM as a personal deity to understand the emotional truth of a God who had once looked the deep in the face and told it where to stop. What the Hebrew Bible ultimately did with YAM was neither erase him nor fully preserve him. It did something subtler and, in its own way, more interesting. It absorbed him. It took the force he represented, the primal, ungovernable, pre-rational chaos that the ordered world floats upon and depends upon and is perpetually in tension with, and folded it into a monotheistic framework where that chaos becomes one of the materials that the single God used to build everything else. YAM is not gone from the Bible. He is everywhere in it. He is in the deep that brooded before light existed. He is in the sea that Job is asked to contemplate from a position of humility. He is in the floods that lift up their roaring in the Psalms. He is in every passage where the text reaches instinctively for the image of wild water held in check by something older and wiser and more powerful than the water itself. 3,000 years of human religious thought, and the same intuition keeps surfacing, that beneath the ordered world, beneath the dry land, beneath the fields, beneath the cities and the laws, and the careful arrangements by which people agree to live together, there is something ancient and fluid and boundless, that the order we inhabit is real and necessary and worth defending, but that it was placed on top of something, that it floats, and that somewhere below it, patient as water has always been patient, the deep continues to move in the dark, the chaos dragon, across 4,000 years. Every culture that has ever lived near the sea has looked out at it and understood, on some level that precedes language, that there is something in the deep that does not wish them well, not because the sea is cruel in any purposeful sense, but because the sea is indifferent, and indifference, when it is vast enough, feels like malevolence. The waves do not decide to take your fishing boat. The undertow does not choose your child. But the result is the same. And so, across virtually every maritime civilization that has left us records, the same figure rises from those cold depths. Scaled, enormous, ancient, coiled around the foundations of the world, biding its time. It has many names. In Ugarit, it was called Lotan. In Babylon, Tiamat. In the Hebrew scriptures, Leviathan and Rahab. In the Norse tradition, Jörmungandr, the world serpent who lies coiled around the roots of the ocean floor. In the book of Revelation, it becomes simply the great dragon, that ancient serpent. And even there, even at the very end of the Christian scriptural canon, it carries the unmistakable signature of something that was already old when civilization began. The names change, the languages change, the theological frameworks change beyond all recognition, but the creature itself, the enormous, multi-headed, chaos-embodying serpent of the primordial deep, remains. It is one of the most durable images in all of human thought, and to understand where it comes from, we need to begin with its earliest, fully preserved form, Lotan of Ugarit, the creature that swam alongside YAM in the oldest waters of Canaanite mythology. The Ugaritic tablets describe Lotan in a phrase that has become one of the most cited lines in all of comparative mythology. The text calls him the twisting serpent, the close coiling one of 7 heads. 7 heads. That specific number, not 3, not 10, not some vague plurality, but exactly 7, will travel with this creature for the next 3,000 years in ways that are almost eerie to trace. It appears in the Hebrew Psalms. It appears in the intertestamental literature of the Second Temple period. It appears in the book of Revelation, where the dragon who wages war in heaven wears 7 heads and 10 horns and is explicitly identified with the ancient serpent of chaos. 7 heads, moving through 3 millennia of mythology, like a thread stitched through a very long cloth. Lotan was associated with YAM. The texts place them in the same mythological neighborhood, both creatures of the chaotic sea, both ultimately defeated by Baal. When the tablets describe Baal's victories, they mention the crushing of Lotan alongside the subduing of YAM, almost in the same breath. They are not identical beings. YAM is the political force, the lord with ambitions, the god who sends messengers and demands tribute. Lotan is something more purely monstrous, less interested in courts and power, and more purely the embodiment of the chaos principle in its most raw, serpentine, physically overwhelming form. If YAM is chaos as governance, as domination, as the claim that disorder has a right to rule, then Lotan is chaos as nature, as the bare biological fact of something enormous and old and coiled in the dark. The relationship between the two tells us something interesting about how the Canaanite imagination understood the deep. It was not a single thing. It was a world unto itself, with its own internal complexity, part political, part monstrous, part liquid and formless, and part disturbingly bodied and real. YAM and Lotan together suggest that chaos was not merely one adversary to be defeated once and then forgotten. It was a condition with multiple expressions, each requiring its own response, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably sophisticated observation about the nature of disorder. The ancient Near East did not imagine one monster in the deep. It imagined a deep and understood that what lived there was various and inexhaustible and would keep producing new shapes long after any particular shape had been defeated. When we move eastward across the ancient world to Babylon, a civilization that overlapped with Ugarit in time and traded with the broader Semitic cultural sphere, we find Tiamat. Her story is preserved in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which scholars believe was composed sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, making it a near contemporary of the oldest Ugaritic material. Tiamat is described as a dragon of the salt waters, the primordial sea, who existed before anything else, commingled in the beginning with her consort Apsu, the freshwater deep. From their mingling, the first gods were born. And then, as the younger gods grew noisy and disruptive, Tiamat was persuaded to make war on them. The god who defeated her was Marduk, the great champion of Babylon, the storm and sun deity who would become the city's patron. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is one of the most elaborate cosmic combat sequences in all of ancient literature. Marduk drives the winds into Tiamat's open mouth so she cannot close it, and then splits her body in two, using one half to form the sky and the other to form the earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Her tail becomes the band of the Milky Way. She is not merely defeated, she is literally dismembered into the fabric of the physical world. The cosmos is built from chaos's body. Order is not something imposed on top of disorder from outside. It is made from disorder's own substance. This is a cosmological idea of breathtaking strangeness and beauty, and it places Tiamat, and by lineage, Lotan and YAM, in a role that is simultaneously adversarial and foundational. The world needs the chaos in order to exist. The sky is made of it. The rivers flow from it. You cannot separate the creation from the creature that was unmade to produce it. And this is why, in mythology after mythology across the ancient world, the Chaos Dragon is never truly killed. It is incorporated. The defeat is always a transformation. In the Hebrew scriptures, the creature arrives under two primary names, and it is worth distinguishing them carefully because they do slightly different work in the texts. Rahab, not the woman of Jericho but the sea monster, the name being an unfortunate homonym, appears primarily in the poetic books, in Job and in the Psalms, as a figure of primordial chaos already defeated. God crushed Rahab. God silenced Rahab. The past tense is deliberate and theologically significant. Rahab belongs to a battle already won, a chaos already subdued, invoked now as evidence of divine power rather than as a present threat. Leviathan is considerably more alive. The most extended description of Leviathan in the entire Bible comes, again, from the book of Job, that inexhaustible well of ancient cosmological imagery, where God describes the creature to Job across 4 consecutive chapters with a specificity and almost affectionate attention to detail that is unlike anything else in the scriptural tradition. Leviathan's back is made of rows of shields, tightly sealed together so that no air passes between them. Fire comes from its mouth, smoke from its nostrils. Its breath sets coals ablaze. The deep boils like a pot when it moves through the water. It has no fear. It looks on everything high and proud as beneath it. It is, the text concludes, king over all the proud. This is not a metaphor for bad weather. This is a being, and the fact that God describes it with such precise, almost tender attention, as one might describe a favorite and terrifying creation, tells us something crucial about what Leviathan means in this context. It is not evil. It is not Satan. It is not the adversary in any moral sense. It is the wildness itself, the outer limit of the ordered world, the thing that exists at the edge of what human comprehension can reach. And God made it. That is the provocative claim buried inside these chapters of Job, that the Chaos Dragon is not God's enemy, but God's creature. That the Lord of the ordered world also lords over the thing that disorder looks like when it has a body. In Job's cosmology, Leviathan is not a problem to be solved. It is a horizon to be respected. The permanent reminder that the world is larger than the human portion of it, and wilder, and that this wildness is not an accident. From there, the serpent continues its long migration through history. The Norse Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, child of Loki, coils around the entire world beneath the ocean, biting its own tail, keeping the world together in its very coiling. Thor will kill it at Ragnarök, and then take 9 steps before dying from its venom. The parallels with the Baal Lotan tradition are not coincidental. They reflect the shared Indo-European and ancient Near Eastern cultural currents that flowed through and around each other across centuries of trade, migration, and storytelling. The specific names and narratives differ. The underlying figure does not. And then comes the Book of Revelation, written in the late 1st century CE, and the serpent arrives at what is, in the Western literary tradition at least, its most dramatically inflated form, the great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, its tail sweeping 1/3 of the stars from heaven, makes war on the woman clothed with the sun and pursues her offspring into the wilderness. The text explicitly identifies this creature as that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. In one stroke, the author of Revelation has done something that would have been unrecognizable to the writers of the Ugaritic tablets. He has moralized the dragon. He has made chaos into evil, made the sea beast into a theological adversary, a being of deliberate malevolence rather than primordial indifference. Lotan and Leviathan were not evil. They were simply the wild. Revelation's dragon has a purpose, an agenda, a hatred. It has become something different. And yet, even in that fully moralized, fully Christianized form, the 7 heads remain. That number, pressed into the text by writers who almost certainly knew nothing of the clay tablets of Ras Shamra, buried beneath 3,000 years of Syrian soil, connects the dragon of Revelation to the dragon of Ugarit by a thread so fine and so long that it takes your breath away when you see it clearly. The tradition is that durable. The image is that insistent. Across cultures that had forgotten one another, across centuries that had erased the original context entirely, the creature kept its heads, 7 of them, always 7, twisting through the deep water of human imagination, patient as YAM himself was patient, refusing to be entirely put down, waiting for the next storyteller to reach for the oldest available image of what darkness looks like when it has a shape. It is still waiting, the discovery that gave YAM back to the world. It is one of the peculiar and recurring gifts of archaeology that the most transformative discoveries are so rarely the product of careful planning. The great buried things of the ancient world tend not to announce themselves to the well-funded expedition with the correct equipment and the right academic credentials. They surface, more often than not, through the intervention of something far less dignified: a construction crew laying a road, a child throwing a stone into a hillside, a farmer doing what farmers have always done, pushing a blade through the earth and hoping for the best, and striking something that the earth had held in secret for 3,000 years. The story of Ras Shamra begins in the spring of 1928 with exactly this kind of accidental encounter. On the Syrian coast, not far from the modern city of Latakia, a local farmer was working a field near a low mound of land. One of those gentle, unassuming rises in the landscape that the Arabic-speaking world calls a tell. Tells are compressed time. They are the accumulated debris of centuries of human habitation, each generation's ruins providing the foundation for the next, until the whole stack of lives and fires and collapsed walls and broken pottery has risen into something that looks, from a distance, like a modest hill. This particular tell, known locally as Ras Shamra, meaning simply fennel head, named for the plant that grew in abundance on its slopes, had been part of the agricultural landscape for so long that no one paid it particular attention. It was simply there, the way it had always been there. The farmer's plow struck stone. Specifically, it broke into the roof of an ancient tomb, a vaulted chamber of dressed stone that did not belong to any era that the field's owner could place. Word reached the authorities. A preliminary survey was organized, and what the surveyors found, when they looked more carefully at Ras Shamra, was not a tomb in isolation, but something considerably larger. The surface signs of an entire buried city, lying under the tell in organized layers, its streets and buildings still approximately intact beneath the accumulated weight of all the centuries that had buried it. Excavations began formally in 1929 under the direction of the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, who would go on to dedicate much of his professional life to this site. What they found in those first seasons was already extraordinary. Palace structures, temples, houses, storage rooms, all belonging to a late Bronze Age city of considerable sophistication and evident wealth. This was a trading port, a crossroads city, a place where merchants from Egypt and Cyprus and the Aegean and Mesopotamia had all moved through and left traces of their presence in the form of imported goods, foreign letters, diplomatic correspondence. The city had been cosmopolitan in a way that the ancient world was more capable of than we sometimes remember. But it was the libraries that changed everything. Not one library, several, distributed across the site in different buildings, each preserving its own collection of clay tablets inscribed in a script that no living person had ever seen before. The script was unlike anything in the existing scholarly vocabulary of ancient writing systems. It was cuneiform. That is, it used the wedge-shaped impressions characteristic of Mesopotamian writing, made by pressing a stylus into wet clay. But the specific arrangement of the wedges did not correspond to any known form of cuneiform. It was not Akkadian. It was not Sumerian. It was not any of the diplomatic or commercial scripts that scholars had spent the previous century painstakingly learning to read. It was something new, something that had been entirely absent from the historical record, until this field, this plough, this spring morning in 1928, opened the ground and let it out. The decipherment came with remarkable speed, which tells you something about both the quality of the scholars involved and the nature of the script itself. Within the first year of serious study, 3 researchers, the French scholars Charles Vihorlot and Edouard Horm, and the German scholar Hans Bauer, working largely independently and by different methodological routes, had cracked the code. The script turned out to be an alphabetic cuneiform, that is, it used the wedge-shaped marks not to represent syllables or whole words in the Mesopotamian manner, but individual consonants in the manner of Semitic alphabetic writing. It was, in essence, a cuneiform alphabet. 30 letters, clean, logical, elegant, and once you understood the system, the language beneath it resolved into something recognizable. A Northwest Semitic language closely related to Biblical Hebrew, Phoenician, and Aramaic. The scholars who had spent their careers mastering the biblical languages found themselves, almost immediately, able to read what the tablets said. What the tablets said was staggering. The mythological texts from Ras Shamra, designated in modern scholarship as ancient Ugarit, the name the city used for itself, were concentrated primarily in what appears to have been a scribal school or temple archive, located between 2 major sanctuaries on the city's acropolis. They were written on rectangular clay tablets, some the size of a large hand, some considerably larger, and they preserved a literature that was already ancient when the city was destroyed. The city of Ugarit came to its end abruptly, sometime around 1185 BCE, almost certainly as part of the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that dismantled civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean in the space of a generation. The scribes who stored the tablets in their archive did not return to collect them. They never had the chance. The library was sealed under its own ruins and preserved, paradoxically, by the very catastrophe that ended the civilization that had produced it. The man who did the most to make those texts accessible to the wider world was a French scholar named Charles Virolot, who published the first editions of the mythological tablets in the 1930s. But the scholar whose name is perhaps most permanently associated with the interpretation of the Ugaritic mythological corpus is Cyrus Gordon, an American Semitist who spent decades arguing, sometimes against fierce academic resistance, for the deep connections between the Ugaritic material and the Hebrew Bible. Gordon was a polymath and something of a controversialist, and not all of his broader theoretical arguments carried the day, but his core insight that the world of the biblical texts and the world of Ugarit were not separate, hermetically sealed traditions, but overlapping cultural streams drawing on the same ancient literary inheritance, has been substantially vindicated by subsequent scholarship. What the Ugaritic texts preserved was nothing less than the literary and religious culture of the world in which the earliest biblical traditions were formed. The people of ancient Israel and the people of Ugarit shared a language family, a geographic neighborhood, a set of overlapping cultural assumptions, and, as the tablets made unmistakably clear, a common stock of mythological imagery. El, Baal, Asherah, Yam, Mot, Lotan. These were not exotic foreign figures from some entirely alien tradition. They were the neighbors. They were the names that the earliest Israelite writers were consciously engaging with, sometimes borrowing from, sometimes arguing against, sometimes absorbing so completely that the original source became invisible beneath the new theological framework. Before Ras Shamra, scholars could see the biblical texts, but could not see what they were in conversation with. After Ras Shamra, the conversation became audible, and it changed everything about how the ancient world looked. The excavations at Ras Shamra did not stop with the initial seasons. They have continued in various forms and under various national and international teams for nearly a century. Each successive dig has added to the picture. More tablets, more palace records, more diplomatic letters, more fragments of poetry and ritual text. The site has yielded evidence of occupation stretching back to the Neolithic period, perhaps 7,000 years before the Common Era, making it one of the longest continuously inhabited locations in the ancient Levant. The late Bronze Age city that housed the mythological library was only one chapter in a story of human presence at that coastal bluff that goes back to a time before agriculture had reached the region. Much of the material recovered from Ras Shamra is now held in the Louvre in Paris and in the National Museum of Damascus. Though the ongoing instability in Syria has raised legitimate fears about the long-term safety of the Damascus collection, fears that remind us, uncomfortably, that the survival of these texts has never been guaranteed. They survived the Bronze Age collapse by accident. They survived 3,000 years of burial by geological fortune. Whether they survive the pressures of the present moment is a question whose answer no one can yet give with confidence. There is something deeply appropriate about this fragility. YAM, after all, is the god of chaos, of the force that resists the ordered preservation of things, that will not be stored and labeled and held steady on a museum shelf. The tablets that tell his story have spent most of their existence in conditions that should have destroyed them. They were buried under a collapsed city. They were recovered by a plow. They were deciphered in a rush of competing scholarly excitement in the 1930s, just as Europe was sliding toward another catastrophe that would disrupt the very universities and libraries where that work was being done. They are being fought over, re-edited, retranslated, reinterpreted across 9 decades of changing methodology and theoretical fashion. They remain, to this day, incompletely understood. Large portions of the Baal cycle, the very texts that tell us about YAM and the battle at the Divine Court, are damaged, fragmentary, missing whole passages that may never be recovered. We read YAM's story through gaps and lacunae, through tablets where the cuneiform trails off into breakage, and we can only guess at what the next line said. Perhaps that is fitting too. The god of the ungovernable deep is not the sort of figure whose story you would expect to come down to us complete and undamaged and perfectly preserved. He arrives, as chaos tends to arrive, partially, insistently, in fragments that nonetheless add up to something unmistakable. You see the outline even through the gaps. You hear the shape of the thing even in the silence where the words are missing. A farmer's plough, a broken tomb roof, a stack of inscribed clay in a language no living person remembered, and from it, rising slowly into the light after 3,000 years of patient waiting, the sea god who had been there before the world had a name for itself. YAM. Still here, still moving in the dark beneath everything, as he always was. A closing meditation stand at the edge of any ocean, on any coast, at any hour, and something very old happens to you, the thinking part of you. The part that has meetings and makes lists and knows what day it is, goes quiet. Not because you decide to quiet it, because the water is so large and so indifferent to your presence that the small machinery of daily selfhood simply pauses. You stand there, the water moves, and for a moment, without quite meaning to, you understand something that cannot be put back into words once the moment passes. The people of ancient Ugarit stood at that same edge. They looked at the same water. And what they did, what human beings have always done when confronted with something too large for direct comprehension, was reach for a story. They gave the water a name. They gave it a face, a lineage, a set of ambitions, a place in a court of divine beings with rivalries and loyalties and the capacity to be, if not defeated, at least pushed back to a boundary. They made YAM, and in making him, they made the sea thinkable. They gave the incomprehensible a shape that the mind could approach without dissolving entirely. This is what myth has always done. Not explain the world, explain our relationship to the world. Give the unmanageable a form. Give the formless an address. What is lost when we stop doing that? When the old stories fade and no new stories rise to replace them with equal seriousness? Is not mere poetry. It is a kind of perceptual capacity, the ability to look at the wild and ungovernable things in existence and hold them in the mind without either sentimentalizing them or being destroyed by them. YAM was not a comfortable god. He was not a reassuring presence. He was terrifying, enormous, and ultimately impossible to finally kill. But the Canaanites made room for him in their cosmology, placed him in relation to other forces, gave him a role in the story of how the world came to be ordered. They did not pretend he was not there. They did not look away from the deep and call it safe. They looked directly at the most frightening thing they could conceive of, and they named it, and they kept telling the story of what it meant that such a thing existed. There is a kind of courage in that, a collective cultural courage that is easy to underestimate because it expressed itself in the form of poetry and religious narrative, rather than anything we would recognize as practical action. But it took something to stand at the shore of the Mediterranean in the 13th century BCE and say, yes, the deep is real. Yes, it is dangerous. Yes, there is a force in it that preceded everything we have built and will outlast everything we will build, and then go home and tend the fields and raise the children and try again tomorrow. The myth did not eliminate the fear. It gave the fear a habitable form. And a fear you can name and place and narrate is a fear you can live alongside without being consumed by it. We have come a long way from Ugarit. The clay tablets are in museum cases. The city is a tell under the Syrian sky, still being carefully excavated, still occasionally yielding something that adjusts our understanding of the world the tablets came from. YAM has not been worshipped in 3,000 years. The divine assembly of El has dissolved into history. And yet, As we have traced across these 6 segments, the force that YAM represented has never left the human imagination. It surfaces in the Hebrew scriptures as the Tehom, as Leviathan, as the sea that Job is asked to contemplate in humility. It surfaces in the 7-headed dragon of Revelation. It surfaces in every mythology that has ever placed something enormous and serpentine in the water beneath the world. It surfaces, wordlessly, whenever a person stands at the edge of the ocean and goes quiet. YAM is not a relic. He is a recognition. The oldest and most honest recognition that human storytelling has ever produced. That the ordered world is real and beautiful and worth every effort to maintain, and that it rests, always, on something it did not create and cannot fully contain. That beneath the dry land, beneath the laws and the languages and the careful arrangements by which we agree to be civilized together, there is a deep. And the deep has no interest in our arrangements. It was here before them. It will be here after. Not as a threat, simply as the truth of what the world is when you get far enough down. Vast and dark and patient and alive, pressing gently against every boundary we have ever drawn, reminding us, in the language of water, that we built everything we love on the surface of something ancient and ungovernable, and endlessly, quietly moving. That is what YAM means. That is what he has always meant.